Um, First of all, I want to introduce myself. My name is Arie Amaya-Akkermans. I live in Istanbul. I'm an art writer, critic, sometimes curator, etc. Here we have Omar Kholeif. He's a senior curator at the MC in Chicago. And at the end, there is the Reem Fadda. She's also a curator at the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. And in the middle, we have Maryam Eisler. She's an art lover and also a patron, someone involved in publication, in exhibiting, and all kinds of related matters, right? So I want to begin with when we talked about collecting as a political act, we were discussing since the beginning, is this really a thing, or is this just like art speak? What does it mean to collect as a political act? I guess that those of us with a gallery background, we know that collecting on an individual perspective is something which is a lot less conscious than it's made to look like. Maybe this consciousness of politics kind of expands later. But in principle, it's a different kind of decision. It's not something so encompassing. And on this, I want to begin with, we are in Art Basel, Miami, so there is a lot of collecting going on here. So I want to ask Maryam, why so many people today hate the word collector?
Because collecting has various meanings. You have collectors and you have shoppers. But if you do collecting the proper way, in my opinion, you can actually possibly make a difference. I can speak only individually. I'm sitting up here with very valued colleagues who are curators, who are academics, and I'm just an individual who's an art lover, who's involved in more ways than one, but I'm speaking as an individual, and I really believe in the soft power of art. We live in very politically violent times. And even just yesterday at the fair, there was violence. So we don't have to go too far to experience these types of violences. But as far as art is concerned, can it stop war? No. Can it stop terrorism? Definitely not. Can it feed the poor? Can it give jobs? No, it cannot. But what I think personally, as far as collecting and supporting the art world and artists is concerned, I think that you can, where politics fails, and we're living in the midst of this, culture can win. And it's an area where there can be open dialogue, there can be critical thinking, and possibly as an individual in the direction that you take, in the way that you work with institutions, you can change perceptions quite easily. And personally, I'm Iranian originally. Just to give you a bit of background, I left in '78, have not returned since then. But I'm very tired. I'm tired of having this negative painting of my country, of my part of the world. It's always been, in the last 40 years since the revolution, it's been painted in a very negative political manner, and due to the revolution. But one tends to forget that there's 3,000 years of heritage, cultural heritage before the last 40, that we've contributed all that we have contributed to the world as far as design, visual arts, architecture, thinking, poetry, Rumi, Hafiz, all these poets that, are wildly read all over the world today come from Iran. So I like to focus through my support of the arts into helping change these perceptions. And I think that through this collecting, if you may, or I hate the word collecting, support of the arts, I think you can do that. Make small differences. It's about passion, it's about civilization, it's about socializing and humanizing. And maybe just to end on this point for this question, it's very fascinating developments that are taking place right now in Iran. For the first time, there's culturally speaking, an openness that is taking place with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tehran, which is finally, after 40 years of sort of absence from the world artistic platform, is now considering lending 60 works to a museum in Berlin. And the director of the museum in Berlin has very much focused on that. In fact, there's an article that came out today in the Financial Times, a full page, and he mentions about this act and how he believes that it will help strengthen civil society in Iran, and that this collaboration is about opening and bringing nations together. So I guess that I shall end on that for this question.
I think here we enter into an expanded notion of collecting that involves many other things regarding exhibition and representation of certain cultures, of certain cultural values, exchanges. One of the most important elements of collecting, I guess, is institutional collecting and how you build an institution. And the acquisition of certain work or another, I mean, it is indeed a political choice that institutions make. We have been talking a lot in the art world, let's say in the last couple of years, you hear about how this museum has a collection that is so wide and how this is too much wide. And somehow there is even like some guilt association with your institution is too wide, especially in the American context. I want to ask Omar to tell us a little bit of how, about the politics of acquisition. Since you just landed in the States, you started working in Chicago at the MCA. So what's your experience with this politics of collecting?
Okay, so thank you so much for the question. I should begin by just deconstructing, the notion or of the term the political, which is about working towards or lobbying towards a special or particular interest. And I see my role as a curator in an institution who has previously worked independently and also in a variety of different contexts, that the role and function of what I do is about galvanizing or pushing together fields of influence to lobby for particular artists and particular narratives. I've recently relocated from London, where I was just recently curator at the Whitechapel Gallery. Kunsthalle, and Maryam is one of our trustees, and definitely an advocate for much of the work that I've been able to do there, to somewhere where there is a museum that does collect. And one of the things that I feel is a responsibility is to bring in particular voices into the conversation. And I certainly feel that my role as a curator is to play at times a corrective role in terms of thinking about historical trajectories of both the modern and the contemporary, and looking at institutions and their collections and thinking who has been left out of this narrative and who should be part of this story. So in terms of what I do, I'm constantly trying to bring artists into that conversation, but I do not desire to reduce an artist to their biography, to their religion, to their ethnicity, but rather to think, i.e. I do not choose to use them tokenistically, which was something that we were discussing earlier, but to think about how that can become an embedded process that speaks to the way that the museum operates and functions within a very specific structure. So, for example, I am very interested in artists who are working with media and technology and using that as a way to think of particular forms of representation and struggle. And so a show that I'm working on at the moment is a collection exhibition using the museum's collection that looks at the transformative potential of media, but I'm also going to use that as an opportunity to invite loans of works by other artists from different contexts, in the hope that by bringing that into the conversation with the existing collection, that I will be able to galvanize patronage to support and acquire that work. And so it's really about looking at the big picture conversation, the big picture questions that drive an institution, and finding a way to bring in different voices into that narrative. And so that is, I suppose, how I see the political functional role of a curator in a collecting museum.
On this point, because Omar, you're working with an institution that has a pre-existing collection. On this topic, I want to turn to Reem, because you are working on the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. It's building an institution from scratch.
Yeah.
So what is how do you relate to Omar's experience, and what's your journey, guys? Like, what are you guys doing at the Guggenheim?
Thank you for the question. I think it is, with the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, we've got a real opportunity to begin to think about building a collection through curatorial and art historical study. And it is really a model that is a complete privilege, as it does not exist. It did not exist prior to that moment, especially within the 21st century, and thinking about what is a contemporary museum and how do you start to shape a collection like that with a large team of curators behind it. So it's a think tank of people, and we involve a lot of advisors from all over the world. The remit of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, we've started with the term the transnational. It's evolved into the idea of the transcultural, really because we were very aware that we did not want to use the word global. Global being something that we were kind of scared from. And it felt very token and very derivative. And at the same time, it did not treat the various problematics that are within collections in a realistic and an in-depth way. So to the question that Omar is saying, how do you represent a collection without being token, but you want to be open to a larger world? You want to be representative of various parts of the world at the same time. And for our particular situation at the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, because we are based in Abu Dhabi, this is the larger kind of Arab region, it's the Gulf. How do you look outward? How could you responsibly take account for where you're positioned and be inclusive of a larger narrative? The art world has been largely Western too. So you can't divorce yourself from that language as well, from these markets. How can you take all of these things into contention, but at the same time be inclusive of your own constituency? That's a real kind of question for us, to bring these two and to marry these two things together. And it's been a really interesting challenge. Again, lobbying is a big thing that I feel I do within the Guggenheim, representing what we are no longer calling the Middle East. We're referring to it as West Asia and North Africa and South Asia as the region that we're looking into. And I am the curator designated for those, for that kind of larger region. And it's been very interesting for us, the ride with the Guggenheim itself, and a museum that is largely based in New York, has outposts in Venice and Bilbao. So very Western-centric. And a lot of my colleagues and people who are aware of the work that the Guggenheim has been doing as an institution, it's very interesting to see how even the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi's collection has been able to influence how the Guggenheim as a foundation has started to think about itself as well. Questioning how, let's say, on the outskirts they are of a larger, diverse other world. How can they be more inclusive of that narrative as well? How can we start to voice all those varieties and communities within an institution that it does not suffice to be only about New York or London or Paris. There are other centers that are equally dynamic and interesting. Bombay, Marrakech, there's Dubai, there's Istanbul, exactly. I mean, there's so many interesting places in the world. Rio. I mean, so this is a moment for people to go beyond that level of comfort. And our institution has been going through a lot of turbulence. It's not easy to come to these arrivals, and collection building can afford to do that, can allow you to go into that turbulent rethinking.
Because we were talking earlier today about how there is this problem in contemporary art, in the Western context, that is at this juncture that is almost post-contemporary, so it's kind of out of energy. And contemporary art is going out of this Western context to look for what's happening in the margins, kind of to feed from this experience, to find source material. at the same time that the Western-centric art world is trying to dictate what art should be in those margins. But as the margins become bigger and bigger and bigger, there is kind of gravity. So it is those margins that start to pull the Western-centric art world and kind of ripping it apart at one point or another. I was also very interested in this notion that Reem and Maryam were discussing of collecting as lobbying and collecting with lobbying. So I would like Maryam to tell us a bit more of how do you see, let's say, like the political aspect of collecting through lobbying, and like what you think that can be achieved? Like, what's your experience, especially in reference to this Tanaboli exhibition that you put together at Wellesley?
Okay, there's two. Okay, let's talk about Tanaboli, and then we can go back to the Tate maybe later. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm a graduate of Wellesley College in the States. I sit on the board, and Wellesley gave a lot to me, so decided at some stage to give back to Wellesley. So we set up with my husband a fund for the Near, Middle, and Far East for the visual arts, and for precisely because both my husband and I believe in the soft power of art, that art is where you can express your ideas, about having critical thinking, about having all the right research, especially in a student academic-led environment where all sorts of possibilities are, the potential is there. So fast forward, this year, it was a very interesting year for me. It was very exciting. I was extremely passionate about the initiative that we established at Wellesley, and which was the first initiative of the fund. And it was an exhibition at the Davis Museum of a great Iranian modernist called Parviz Tanavoli, who's known as the father of Iranian sculpture. And the show was co-curated by Lisa Fishman, the director of the museum, and Professor Shiva Ballari of Brown University. And on many levels, this was a big moment, really, for everyone, because politically speaking, this show was being shown in the US right in the midst of the nuclear sanction deal negotiations, before anything came to fruition. So I would say that it was a very bold and courageous decision on the part of the board of Wellesley to go ahead and give their okay to this. They could have very easily said no, but I think that it actually very much goes back to what the institution and the college stands for, which is about being a top-notch, open-minded, liberal arts institution. And I was very, very proud to be associated with that, and extremely grateful for the support that the show received. It was, even though Tanavoli is one of the greatest, modernist known globally, really, happens to be from Iran, and he was extremely active in the United States in the 60s, with many shows in Minneapolis, with many exhibitions that he held, and he taught contemporary Iranian art. And one of his greatest allies and supporters was a wonderful woman by the name of Abby Gray, who spent a lot of time in Iran in the 60s and 70s, collected a very large collection of modernist Iranian art, and upon her death, bequeathed the collection to NYU, which is now known as the Gray Art Gallery. So his relationship with the US was very, very active until the revolution. Of course, the revolution took place, and all sorts of disruptions, personal and otherwise, went hand in hand with that. So this was effectively, after 40 years of absence, his first US retrospective in 40 years. And it was incredible. It was incredible because he was tearful on a personal level, came into this room, saw 50 years worth of work under his eyes. He hadn't seen that. It was amazing for the college to have taken this bold move, and the media coverage was just beyond all our expectations. It was absolutely incredible, and so could not have asked for more.
Okay, so I want to go back from this into something related. So there is this aspect of lobbying and soft power associated with collecting. Here I want Omar and Maryam to engage with each other about what's the difference between the experience of Britain and the United States on this field of like it seems that the American art bureaucracy is extremely complicated. That it's a lot like, I mean, Europe seems to be more of an informal place when it comes to boards and money, but then there is no money. And the States seems to be like a very professionalized place to work in. So what you guys can tell us about the difference between these contexts?
I mean, I won't speak too extensively, having been a recent arrival to the US. But what I can tell you is that it's an issue of scale, an issue of process that we were talking about earlier, which has to do with this. Britain it comes from a much more socialist context. So, you know, there is universal healthcare, there is public funding by the government, but there isn't a culture of individual philanthropy until at least maybe in the last 10 to 15 years. And the reason that culture has emerged has to do with the funding cuts from those governments. However, there are no incentives, there are no tax breaks for individuals to endow a post, to give a work to a museum, or to sit on an acquisition committee, etc. While as in the US, the way the system works is that individuals, one of the ways that they participate civically in society is by giving to institutions, and institutions, non-profits here, are 100% funded by a culture of individual philanthropy, which means that the way that you operate or navigate these two terrains is very, very different. So in the US context, for example, if I want to acquire a particular work, there are trustees and there are people who sit on our acquisition committee who are able to step in and to acquire that work, or to, for example, pledge that it be a promised gift, and that becomes a very nuanced and ongoing and engaged conversation. While as in the UK, there is much less of that occurring. However, as Maryam can tell us now, and I'm going to hand over to you, that there have been different kinds of structures or systems that have evolved to try and accommodate that. One of those things being very much the Tate's regional acquisition committees, of which Maryam is a co-chair, and I think it's an incredibly interesting model to think about how an institution is able to galvanize and lobby like-minded individuals who want to contribute to a broadening of an institution's collection and discourse. So,
Maryam, please.
So my experience in the US is quite limited. It was limited to Wellesley, and it was an amazing experience, very fruitful, and we did not have too much controversy or bureaucracy to deal with. And because I think the choice of the artist, Tanovoli, is somebody who is non-political and non-religious. In fact, he sits really a foot in both worlds between Iranian tradition and universal philosophies, one of which is, you know, the philosophy of nothingness, which is a philosophy that has been widely explored all over the world, from Sartre to Lacan to you name it. It was a perfect choice of an artist to create this dialogue, this exchange, this cultural exchange effectively, and it really, as part of the equation, it worked out for everyone. So very positive, minimal nonetheless experience in the United States. As far as the UK is concerned, well, I can speak for the Tate, where I co-chair, as Omar said, the Middle East Acquisition Committee, MENAC, Middle East North Africa Acquisition Committee, which we set up about 7 years ago. And the way these committees were set up was pretty much derived from the fact that there's less and less public funding in the UK for the arts, and it was a very clever way of gathering like-minded individuals around common interest, if you may. And so this was set up 7 years ago, and I'm proud to say, you know, we're 42 members today, and we've had 7 years of wonderful acquisitions for the Tate, adding richness to their collection. But what I find fascinating about the way it's done, and I wholeheartedly support the manner in which the Tate acquires its work, is that even though the acquisition committees are set up in a regional manner, once the works of art are acquired, they are actually integrated into the permanent collection around thematic concerns or around art historical platforms. So we move away from this, from the geography, if you may, And I believe that that's a very healthy thing to do, because once you have limits, geographical limits, those geographical limits imply intellectual limits. And that's a very nice way of ghettoizing ourselves. And we're no longer in that kind of world. We need to be in a world where there's open exchange. So as an example, for instance, a recent artist which the Tate has focused on quite significantly is an older generation modernist Lebanese artist by the name of Salwa Rauda Shuker, who had her own solo show at the Tate, yet she's also in conversation with Western artists of her time. So very easily you could see Salwa being in conversation and on display with a David Smith, for instance, around similar types of concerns. Another example at the Tate, which I'd like to point out, is a recent example of an exhibition which was set up called The World Goes Pop. Interestingly, they looked at the whole pop culture from a non-Western canon of art. And of course, in the 60s, we lived in a time when you didn't have the social media you had today, you didn't have the sorts of exchanges, everybody was relying on, magazines and travel. But it is fascinating to see that during that period, a historic period, there were similar mind thoughts and mind processes and philosophies that were going on. So this particular show looked at, pop culture in the manner that it was seen in Japan, in Brazil, in the Middle East. And funnily enough, Tanovoli was actually the choice for the Middle East, even though he himself doesn't think he's a pop artist. But so those are the types of approaches that the Tate as an institution takes in displaying the arts and acquiring the arts. And I think it's a model that's been very successful and that's being now used outside the remits of the Tate itself, and other institutions are looking at this model. So
I want to touch on something related to collecting as like patronage and how it can affect artistic environments. I feel that because the four of us, we work or have worked in the Middle Eastern context, where there is a lot of institution building going on, it seems that we have these institutions in the Emirates, in Lebanon, in Turkey, that basically we don't have real public institutions, so there is these private institutions that are coming to fill this gap, collectors, patrons, donors. But then you come to a situation, like it's the situation we have in Turkey, where you have 3-4 families that own the entire art world. What happens with this? How do we go around this? And what does it mean for art? Things like, again, I speak about Istanbul, that we live in a city where our biennial is a private brand. And because it's a private brand, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But the problem is that there is no accountability. Any decisions can be made. I want I want Reem to speak on this a little bit.
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer this question, but because in the case of Abu Dhabi, it's the government really that is producing these institutions at large, and it's not privately owned, and there's a lot of accountability to get to that point in building these institutions. But I do think that there is, we were discussing this privately in the back about how sometimes I find it more frustrating to work with one private collector than it is to work with an institution in its kind of in-depth knowledge, because there becomes a level of there is that immediacy of taking a decision, of being I think what I want to talk about is that being a collector wields a lot of power, even as an individual. And I think that's something not to be taken so lightly. And the yes and no should not come so fast, in a facile way. And I think there should be some much more, for our region, there should be a lot of generative efforts to consolidate, lobby, come together and understand the wielding power of that kind of collector base. In the potential of it becoming institutions and what that means, as we know in Beirut, for example, there are many initiatives that have just happened now concurrently that are private collectors building institutions. And I think I personally applaud those efforts, because if I want to think about the history of the Guggenheim foundation, it was Solomon R. Guggenheim. He had a curator friend who became the first director of the museum, and through a vision and through actual efforts, were able to build a legacy that became the Guggenheim Foundation. And that was also Peggy Guggenheim in Venice, and that kind of joint effort became a larger, let's say, outwardly looking global institution. So the most small efforts, when consolidated, can actually build up to be something quite large, and their largesse is outreaching. I think, yes, there is a level of it that can become a little bit dictatorial or problematic, especially if it's coupled with ignorance. And I think that is something that I would caution a lot of collectors from falling prey to. Educating themselves, looking at partnering with institutions, understanding their role in influencing institutions, working together with other collectors, other curators, artists. I think with gallerists, of course, I mean, all of this kind of community is essential to build a level of knowledge and activity that is healthy.
Omar, I want to hear about your experience with acquisitions in this American context.
I mean, maybe I really can't. I'm so recent to the American context. I mean, what I actually want to add to what Reem was saying is that especially in the context of the Middle East or the broader Wanasa region, where we all have ties and have developed projects, is just how, for me, I think that the emphasis on the individual should not be seen as a bad thing, because, and indeed, we need to applaud those individuals who have really stuck their neck out for, in many cases, no real gain to try and develop an ecology and an infrastructure and the educational platform for the region. So, for example, in Amman and in Egypt, in Amman and in Jordan, pardon me, God, the Khaled Shuman Foundation, Soha Shuman's leadership of that organization as a collecting institution, as a museum that is open to the public, that puts on a rigorous contemporary program, I think is incredibly important, and it's a private individual endeavor. Yes, there may not be public accounts or public chains of why particular exhibitions or works become accessioned into the collection, but the value of the work that has been done is incredibly significant and feeds into a wider ecology, where now you have, for example, in Amman, younger collectors who are, such as, for example, Ahmed and Serena Abu Ghazali, who are collecting not only art from the region, but trying to build a truly international collection that posits Western and locally or culturally specific practices, as it were, from that region into a public domain. Likewise, I think in thinking about this in parallel to, for example, Egypt, where I'm from, Egypt has an incredibly rich historical cultural output. However, and especially in relation to visual culture and the modernists from Abdelhadi Ghazar and others. However, the Egyptian publicly funded institutions are not accessible. There may be lines and bureaucratic chains of accountability, but they are not accessible. And when I was writing my PhD, trying to look specifically at the Egyptian modernists, I went to the most senior person in this kind of board of individuals who's involved with Egyptian antiquities and museums and said, I want to know, reportedly there are 8,000 works that are modern and contemporary in your collection that are in storage somewhere. I want to know what those works are. And he couldn't put me in a direction to access that information. Although there are lines of accountability and it's a government-funded organization, I couldn't access that. So the fact that, for example, in Amman with the Khaled Shuman Foundation, or in Sharjah with the Barjil Art Foundation, I can go to a website and find these artists and high-resolution images. That is a hugely important thing, and it is a political gesture about access. You know, this idea of wanting to make things accessible in order to speak to speak truth to the systems and mechanizations of power, that, making this stuff accessible is not dangerous, because, they're making these artists, these practitioners who speak about very complex social, economic, and political ideas, making that work public is an enriching endeavor. So I would really like, in summary, really to emphasize that the role of the individual is really not to be undermined in this very important context or arena.
Maryam.
I think, on a very personal note, I think there comes a great deal of responsibility, frankly, attached with the role of collecting or being a patron or being an art lover. And I think that it goes beyond just purchasing artworks, frankly speaking. That's all very nice and dandy, but, especially when you refer to the Middle East, or in my case in Iran, I know that I live in a very privileged position in a very sanitized society, and that effectively, over the last 40 years especially, supporting artists, especially those who are from Iran, takes a great deal of responsibility. These guys are dealing with, hand-to-mouthing. It's about the bread, that they eat every day. And they don't have the luxury of being able to have access to the types of exchanges or platforms that other artists from around the world necessarily have access to. So personally, I felt that, beyond the act of collecting per se, I think being involved with supporting residencies has been extremely important. Bringing these guys out, putting them in a context where they can have exchange of ideas, see how other similar-minded, individuals, youth from around the world think. And often it really results in incredible objectives. One example being, for instance, the Delphina Foundation in London, who does this very well. And these sort of things have great results in London, because London itself is a cultural melting pot, and there's great constructive intellectual clash and chiasm, and it results into really wonderful results. And there's the issue of publications. I think that in the Middle East we've been quite weak in terms of referencing and cataloging, and I think that getting involved with publications, I see many friends and colleagues who are involved in this, particularly here, Canvas Magazine, Ali Hussein, Transglobe Publishing. These guys are, what they're doing is an act of patronage as well. So aligning yourself and supporting these types of activities is very, very key, because it is about stamping a collective memory for the region and this part of the world, which has lacked incredibly these types of activities. And hand in hand with that goes, documentaries and film and articles about really starting to create a proper memory base for the artistic initiatives and activities that take place.
I want to wrap up this with saying that when you ask the question about whether there is a politics associated with collecting, obviously we see that there is. It's interesting to think about it from the perspective that individual decisions matters, in the sense of, this isn't only about institutions, because institutions, in the end of the day, especially private institutions, they come down to individuals, which make important choices. Whether all art is political and the politics of art and collecting, Omar was saying to me, essentially in one way or another, or in different layers, all art is political, and also kind of the artists we work with, the regions we work with. Then when you work through Art Basel, and you look at so much work, and you say, I need to think about this twice, I am not so sure. But I think that at some point, Mari Spirito, she said, who is kind of my mentor, she said to me at some point in the conversation, there is not one art world, but there are different art worlds, and these art worlds, they do not always overlap. I guess that it is important for us, especially because we're coming from the margins of the art world, that things do overlap, and it's not only a question of visibility, but of the kind of the future of art itself. So I want to thank you for your contributions, and I guess, Mari, we open the floor for questions.
First off, I want to thank you for the opportunity to hear you guys today, and relish the fact that I can afford to spend $40 to come here and hear you, which has something to do with the lack of access, even in this country, for such a quality panel. I also want to comment on the fact that there are certain parts of this country and certain states in this country that have quite a large socialism background and have put money into art for years. I speak of Wisconsin, which I know that you're going to get a chance to go to, given that you're in Chicago, and I would speak to the public funding of the university system there and my own experience of growing up there in the public schools, not having a whole lot of experience with art, but recognizing that the public does play a role in rural parts of this country where there is a socialism background relative to support for the arts. So I want to thank you for that.
I've been to each of your countries, and I've also been to North Korea. This might be a subject for a whole nother panel, but you haven't talked at all about art as a propaganda tool. And North Korea has that fine-tuned, using art as a propaganda tool.
I think in our meeting before the talk, we actually were talking about, like the two sides of soft power, because in a region like the Middle East, when art can constitute such such great soft power, it can also be used as a propaganda tool. But I guess that this is something that applies, not only to the Middle East, like not only to the non-Western world, not only in to countries that are not exactly democratic. I think on the broader scale of things, if you look at all these ideas of like how the Americans were showing modernist art in Paris to counter the Russians and this kind of Cold War art politics, so this applies, not only to us, but to the entire art world, I think, historically.
Yes, I want to actually also say this, it's so interesting that this panel gets associated with North Korea and, and socialism, socialism not from a European perspective. But of course, I would say that art in general, the political, is a sign of society, and what kind of art you allow is mirroring what kind of society you have, and you have the kind of society which is mirrored in the art, and I think that goes across the entire spectrum.
Well, I guess, I would certainly agree with that. I guess, it's something like when you come to an art fair and people tell you, that the art is so bad, like everything is so bad, and you say, actually, the art is as good as the world is.
Yes.
In general.
I hope it's a little bit better than the world. I hope that.
Yeah, the world can be a depressing place sometimes.
But by the way, to answer you as well, or to actually complement what you're saying, some of these guys, these artists, sometimes don't have a choice, but to be political in their art, because that's just the nature of the beast, the environment they live in. And they use art as a tool of expression, freedom of expression. And it's one of the only fields where they can actually do that. So, and as you say, as a result, it translates into the psychology of a country, very much so.
And also I just wanted to add to that discussion, because we were also talking about this earlier, is that it's interesting how there is a level of hegemony for an art world that is easy on the eyes, content kind of facile, formalistic in its nature. You can buy it, put it in your bedroom, you're going to be happy with it. And I think there is the rest of the world, and there's a huge kind of historical contingency of art that was done from the early century in South America, across the Arab world, in Africa, in East Asia, that was dealing with questions about that formalism was not enough. And they really had to think about issues about their society. Where is their society going? how can art be a mechanism for them to change and influence in visual language? How and where are they going for their own critical kind of input? And this is at the same time, I mean, for example, some of the artists that I've been studying are the Casablanca School. The Casablanca School in Morocco in the 50s, in the end of the 50s, you know, these are people that were taught in Paris. So they were in discussions, they knew all about the Western art canon, but they come and arrive in Morocco at a time when their country is gaining independence from Paris, and they want to make a statement that they're not Western. They're no longer colonized. And how is their art critical in that aspect? And they, for example, for them, it was also important for them to be critical against their own governments and critical against that own kind of way of how the mainstream society was being shaped. So for example, they thought that it's important to make a point that they're a diverse culture, that they are not just Arab, they are African. They are about Amazigh culture. So the Berber culture is also something that is very important for that visual language and vernacular to start to appear in painting. And it's very interesting to see the prognosis, the progression that country in its evolution of thinking has arrived at today. I think because we had paintings by artists like Farid Belkahi, Shaba'a, all of them that talked about that diversity, that they're Jewish, that they're Muslim, that they're Arab, that they're African, that they're all of these things combined together, you have today a Morocco that is open-minded, that consolidates all of these ideas together and really represents that diversity. And it's very important even for the government to start to adopt that. So let's look at the way where art really shapes through the visual language, starts to shape psyches of societies at large.
I would like to make one last point is, you just talked about modernism, and, there's still lots of battles, I suppose, to be won. To look at modernism purely from a Western perspective, I think is wrong. And, I just read, I have to point this out, it's been a pet peeve, it's been bothering me for the last week. I read this, and I think it's really bothered all of us. There was an article that was written in New York Times by a journalist by the name of Deborah Solomon. And she is making a point about the opening of the Metropolitan Contemporary Art Museum, headed by Sheena Wagstaff, who I know very well. I worked with Sheena at the Tate. She's probably one of the best curators I've ever come across, and I have huge admiration for Sheena. And this lady reduced her to nothing simply because she has decided to open the Metropolitan, the contemporary side of the Metropolitan, with a modernist Indian artist by the name of Nasreen Mohammadi, who's deceased, 20 years now. And the tone of the article is very much, how dare you start your museum or our museum with a non-Western modernist. And these are the types of, closed-mindedness attitudes that we need to deal with. And, it's all over. It's not, I'm not saying it's here, it's all over the world. And we need to open all our minds to this.
Reem, so we'll close with you.
And I just want to add is that contemporary art at large has become about politics and about, responding to society. So, and that has come from a legacy of other parts of the world. And because people can travel and really start to relate to these other parts of the world. So it's very important to us to acknowledge that we have not arrived at a contemporary language of art because we are cocooned into our own societies. It's because artists and art practitioners are open, they travel, they negotiate, they dialogue with other parts of the world, and I think this is something that is bound to be the time for us to acknowledge that.
Okay, thank you guys.